Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Ad America TV. Hi, I'm Maya Trainer. I'm one of the e-guides at Ad America, and we welcome our audience joining us online. We truly hope that you are doing well and staying safe amidst this outbreak. Anyway, for those of you who are first-timers here, hi, welcome to Ad America TV for the first time. Ad America is the U.S. Embassy's American Center. Our mission is to provide a space for young generations of Indonesia to learn more about the United States. We have temporarily moved to a solely digital platform so you can enjoy our program from the comfort of your own home and help fund the curve of COVID-19. Don't forget to leave your questions in the comment box below, and our panelists will answer them later in the seminar. And for our friends here who are joining us through Zoom, there are a couple of features that you can use to actively participate in the seminar. You can use the raise hand section to ask your questions with your video on, or you can also use the chat box section whenever you wanted to say hi to the other participant and also the panelist as well. But please keep in mind to use these features wisely, right? Cool. Now today we will be having a session titled Strategies in Debating. But as per usual, before we begin, we are going to have a social media quiz. You guys ready? Okay, here we go. The question is, what is the name of the Asian parliamentary style debate competition participated in by students of middle schools and held by Ad America? A. Young Thinking Troopers. B. Young Thinkers Trophy. C. Youth Thinkers Trophy. Or D. None of the above. I will repeat one more time. Listen carefully. What is the name of the Asian parliamentary style debate competition participated in by students of middle schools and held by Ad America? A. Young Thinking Troopers. B. Young Thinkers Trophy. C. Youth Thinkers Trophy. Or D. None of the above. You can participate in this quiz through our social media comment section, and stay tuned till the end of this program to find out if you get the answers right. Now, one more thing before we begin, please don't hesitate to take a selfie, capture this moment, and share through your social media and let everyone know that you are having a great time with Ad America. And don't forget to tag us on Instagram at ATAmerica. And now, without further ado, please welcome our speaker for today, Robert Berry.
G'day everyone, how are we all doing? It's good to be here and to see everyone. So my name's Rob. I'm coming to you from my office today. Everyone else has left me, so I'm here alone on a Friday night with all of you, and I'm very excited to be here. So firstly, thank you to all the team at America and everyone who has put this all together. I'm really excited to be coming here and presenting today and judging over the weekend. I won't reveal the name of the tournament because I don't want to give away the answer to the quiz prematurely, but I'm really excited and really looking forward to it. All right, so today we're going to look through strategy in debating, and in particular, I'll focus on 3-on-3 debating, or debating that has two teams as opposed to like British parliamentary or other formats that have more than two teams. I have a few different areas I want to cover in the presentation today. We'll probably look at like cases in general and then go through some speakers, speaking roles, I should say, and then I want to finish up with a look at how to use principles strategically in debates. And then as we go along, please continue to drop your questions in there. If I don't get them during the presentation, we'll get to them at the end, as the MC said, and hopefully the presentation will be nice and engaging. The last note I'll make is I have a slideshow today, but I don't normally put a whole lot of words on the slideshow, so you might have to take more notes than just what's on the slides during the presentation. But I hope we'll all be able to follow along. So let me make sure I can share my screen and that I get this right. We tested it before and it worked, unlike my microphone before, so hopefully things are improving. All right, everyone can see that, I hope. Seems to be working on my end, so let's get rolling then. So I'm going to talk about strategies in debating today, and I think the first thing I want to cover before we actually get into it is to talk a bit about why strategy, or what strategy is, I guess, and why it is so particularly important in debates. Because I think the big problem at times that debaters have, and this is both at school and often at university as well, is that we just go out there and we throw out a bunch of arguments to the world and hope that they stick. But then never think about how those arguments work together or what those arguments are trying to achieve as an overall ultimate goal. And that's what strategy is. It's about thinking about how our arguments work together and developing your case and developing your argument to think about the debate altogether. The one last note I'll make, sorry, I should have said earlier, is I've got two screens going here. So if ever looking over here, I'm not ignoring, I'm just looking at the other screen that has the presentation on it. So let's, with that in mind of what strategies are, the first thing I think I want to look at is around, if I get slide to move, around case building. Now, there's actually something I want to talk about just before we get into models, and that is to say, when coming up with your cases should be built around ideally something that we call a win strategy. Now, a win strategy can be a difficult or confusing idea to get your head around. It took me a while. But basically what a win strategy is, it's figuring out and deciding how you intend to win the debate. So that often looks like some sort of like summary or coming together of all your arguments of what you're going to prove. So if we're talking about a very, very simple example like that we should ban smoking, the win strategy for affirmative would probably be, we're going to show you that, or the win strategy I should say would be that we're going to prove that smoking overall has more harms than any particular benefits, and that banning it is the best way to go. And that's not something you say out loud or that you use as like rebuttal or an argument, but it's something that you and your team keep coming back to, is we have to keep enforcing these aspects to try and execute that win strategy effectively. And to do that, all your arguments and your model and all the rebuttal you do comes together with a purpose to execute that win strategy to show the judge what you're trying to prove at the end of the debate. And so that's why I think the first good place to start is with building your case and looking specifically at hard and soft models. Now, this obviously only applies to debates that require a model, so should motions where we're making a change in the world. But if you have a debate that isn't a should debate, it's like an empirical debate, it might be something a bit different, but there's probably still some degree of similarities here, although the majority of debates you'll do will be about hard and soft models. So let's think about this. I'm not sure if anyone's heard this before, so if it is repetitive and you've heard this before, I apologize. But when you think about models, they exist on a spectrum. So you have, on the one hand, models that are really, really what we call hard. So they're going to be likely to be very, very effective, but carry some risks or some harms. And then the other end of the spectrum, we have models that we call that are soft, and they are likely to have very, very limited effectiveness, but have fewer harms associated with them. And so if we were talking about banning smoking again, and we'll get to more complex examples as the presentation goes on, but I think it's useful to start with some simple ones just to get our heads around the concepts. If we're going to ban smoking, a hardline model would be summary execution on the street for anyone we see smoking a cigarette. Now, I reckon if we did that, that would probably be pretty effective, and not a lot of people would smoke because people don't like being summarily executed on the street. But obviously there's one gigantic flaw with that argument, and that is the little thing of murdering people, which we probably don't want to do. So at that point, you're probably likely to lose that debate if you have that model, because you've made it so bad that while you solve it, what we call externalities or the harms generated by that model are just not worth the benefits of banning smoking. We go the other end of the spectrum now to soft models, where we'd say, we'll give people a 5-cent fine if they're rich for smoking, and that'll be about it. That model is probably not likely to be effective because it is such a small fine and it's only going to apply to a certain number of people, so it doesn't actually achieve any of the benefits. The benefit or the good part about that model, you could argue, is that there's no real harm to doing that. Like, no one gets hurt from doing that model, but you don't achieve anything. So what's the point in doing it? So when you're thinking about your case, you need to think about, where do we think we can successfully place that our model on that line and then defend it. I think it's the most important part of strategy then, because once you figure out where your model sits on being hard and soft, you can then frame the rest of your case around defending that positioning. So if you go a bit more hardline with your model, you need to know, you then know that you need to run arguments that trade off those harms to either show why those harms won't exist or why they just don't matter compared to the benefits that exist. Or similarly, if you're going to softline, because you want to avoid having any arguments about the harms, you've then got to be prepared to say, here's why the benefit we get, even though it might be smaller, is absolutely crucial and therefore it is still justified, even though we might not achieve quite as much change. So that's, I think, really important, because it's trying to get yourself set up all the way. And I see a lot with school teams, particularly here in Australia, where they just go so soft line to just try and avoid any arguments. They don't make any change, which is not a useful thing to do. So the tip I think I'd start with here is it is better to sort of, if you're not sure where to go, try and go a little bit more hardline, because the more clear your benefits are, the easier it is to trade things off. So if you're unsure, probably, go hardline or go home. I think that's the first place to start. This is also important to consider from the negative team. Because the negative team, while it doesn't always have a model, it might have a counter model, or it more normally defends the status quo, or if it's doing like something in between, like we support the status quo except thing A, B, and C we change. It also needs to think about where it sits on that line, and then how the rest of its case deals with that. But more importantly, from the negative team, you want to be thinking about identifying as early as possible where the affirmative team's model sits on that spectrum, because that then impacts your rebuttal. So if you don't even know where to start with rebuttal, if you can pick where that model sits on the line, you've already got your ideas. So the affirmative team gives a model, it's too hardline, great. We know that there are lots of harms here. We just need now to base our rebuttal around proving that those harms are worse than what the harms are of the status quo. So status quo harms less bad than harms with model. Or if they go too soft line, just hit them over the head with the idea they don't actually make any change, and therefore, even if you have some small harms or some small objections or reasons why we shouldn't do the motion, those are more likely to win because the benefits in the affirmative are even smaller. And already, your rebuttal then starts to fall into place. And the way to do this in terms of the case is your first speaker identifies that in their rebuttal, says they've gone super soft line here, here's what this means, and then your second and your third speakers begin to structure the case or structure their rebuttal around hitting those key things. And that's the first, I think, big strategy way to think about how cases interact with each other. I want to work through a bit of an example because I think this is the classic example of these things. So, I've got two examples here. I want to start with the second one, actually, about intervening in Venezuela, because I think that makes more sense to start there. So IR debates, I think, are the classic example, IR international relations, of debates where hard and soft becomes really important. Because this motion here is pretty vague. It doesn't say economically, it doesn't say invade, it doesn't say use drone strikes or whatever. It just says intervene. So it's up to the affirmative team to define what intervention means. Now, if we were to, and I don't think we should do this, I want to be very clear because it's being recorded, if we were to say we should drop a nuclear bomb on Venezuela, that I'm pretty sure would stop whatever's going on in Venezuela. But that's obviously immoral. So that's how that hardline there would play out. If we were also to send a letter saying, hey, can you please stop any violence that's going on, probably also likely to be ineffective. What you're probably more looking at in a debate like this is something like economic sanctions of some kind, or maybe some kind of either military intervention or aided military intervention where we don't necessarily like get troops on the ground from the West or from the UN, but we support existing forces on the ground or something like that. And let's say those are the two options tossing up in prep. If we do the military one, probably maybe more of a chance you can logically prove that be effective. Maybe that won't work in the real world, but you can logically prove it out in a debate. But putting troops on the ground probably does have some harms. So you'd have to sort of immediately start thinking about, well, we need an argument there about why there won't be harms of like continuing civil war, or why there won't be harms of Western troops like doing awful things and things like that to balance it out. But if we went the other way and went and said, well, economic sanctions is where we're going to go, maybe that creates less harms than what a military intervention would, but is it likely to be as effective? Like, are things going to change as a consequence? And then you have to make arguments as to why the economic sanctions are definitely going to be effective. And I think that's a useful sort of example to work that through. But sometimes topics, like the first one, are a bit more specific in what you have to do. So this one here, and I I've seen this topic set in like different versions over the years, but it's always something on the lines of that fast food should be sold with graphic images of the animals involved. So you go to McDonald's, you buy your cheeseburger, and there's a picture of a cow about to be slaughtered on the wrapping paper. And obviously that's some kind of disincentive to make you turn vegetarian, or to at least be cognizant of the harms that exist when we consume meat, and what the consequences are to animals. So in this one, the debate's kind of telling affirmative team it has to be a little bit hardline, because it has to show some degree of graphic imagery. And if you decide to go too soft line in this one and make that strategic decision, we're going to go really soft line, like it'll just be a picture of a happy cow, but it won't actually, be too violent. There'll be no blood, or there'll be no death involved. Then they're not meeting the burden of the debate. And that means they don't actually win the debate because they haven't actually proven the topic. So you have to be cognizant of what the topic is also asking you to do in order to make sure you actually set up what you need to do to win the debate. So keep those couple things in mind, I think, when building your case. And that, I think, is important, because then that flows down to the rest of your arguments and how you build the rest of your case, which, funnily enough, is where we're going in the next slide. So this is what I think is important as well in terms of debates. You need, in any debate, to think strategically about having a strong setup and a strong sort of stance of what your team believes in the world, or what it will do. And I guess stances are more important for negative teams, because the affirmative should already do this through its model. But you need to be clear about what your team actually believes, so that you can assess all the rest of things about whether you're being hard and soft, or how you're going to attack. But importantly, flowing on from that is what we call comparatives. And this is probably also just good debating as well as being good strategy. But I think it's to think about comparatives outside of strategy, I think, is probably not giving them the importance they deserve, because they should be a part of your strategy as well. So what I mean by comparative, because it's a big debating term that really means nothing, but we give it a lot of meaning in debating because we like using unnecessarily complicated and fancy words. So what a comparative is just the difference between, or the act of comparing between two different sides of the debate. Because any debate is generally about two worlds. It's like two or three worlds, I guess. There's world one that the affirmative team's setting up, and then there's world two that the negative team's setting up. And those and comparative is just saying which of those worlds is better and why it is better. So when you're thinking about making your arguments, you should be strategically thinking about what is this model doing that actually changes in the world. And that change there, that difference, is where you need to be basing your arguments around, proving that difference is good or bad if you're on the negative team. So thinking about always bringing those arguments back to the comparative and saying, not just that we've proven this thing is true, but it is better than or worse than what the other side is saying, or the other world. That, I think, is an absolutely essential part of any sort of strategy or strategic approach to debating. I saw the question come through in the chat as well. I'll get to that one at the end, because it's a bit different to what's in the slideshow, but I think it's a good question, so we will come to that. So I think that's that big thing on comparatives. Let's now move on to the next part. There's actually an example to go with it, I should say. So this is actually a debate I did last night, and the setup, I think, really hurt us in this debate, because we were on the negative and didn't do the setup very well. So the motion here is that former colonial powers should never intervene militarily or economically in favor of one side in a civil war or rebellion in a former colony. There's a lot of words in there. So just to break it down, all this motion's basically saying is that a former colonial power like Britain or France should never do anything if there is a civil war or something going wrong in a country that they had colonized or occupied in the past. We were on the negative team, so we're obviously saying that they should get involved sometimes. And now we had this big setup planned in prep. We just never properly said it in the debate about when we would actually engage. So we were like, it'll only be when we're just all these principles about why we should intervene. And then at that point, they never actually discussed what the alternative was if those powers didn't engage, which meant that the closest we got to winning was executing one part of our win strategy, and that was to show that awful things happen unless countries get involved in these specific set of circumstances because they never dealt with how they fixed it. So they didn't engage in the comparative, which I think hurt them a lot because they needed to show why these specific countries intervening would be worse than not intervening given this characterization. And that actually, I think, is another useful tie-in to the next thing I want to talk about, which I think is out of order. Yeah, sorry, they're a bit out of order, the slides. My apologies on that one. I want to talk about characterization now. Again, another unnecessarily large debating phrase. Characterization is just all about painting a picture for your adjudicator of what the world looks like and why it looks that way. And characterization is kind of a buzzword that can be used for anything. So I can characterize why a world in which we intervene in some country is better. But you also can say characterization is about describing why an actor or a stakeholder in a debate, someone that's like connected to or affected by the motion, is going to act in a certain way. And I think characterization is an essential part of strategy because that means it's all about making sure the debate happens in the sort of like world that you want it to happen or in the description that you want it to happen and not let the other team win the ground. And I think I've got this quote here about, we're not just the battle, but the ground the battle takes place on. Like, Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War, so hopefully some people got a bit of a chuckle out of the joke about something he probably said, or something he might have said if he was a debater. I'm going to assume you're all laughing, but you're just all on mute because I am just, that funny. But importantly here, you don't want to have a debate on the other team's terms. You don't want them to tell the adjudicator what the intervention or what the policy will look like. You want to tell the adjudicator what it will look like. And that does take some proving and needs to be thought about in a lot of effort in prep to actually make sure it's really clear what these things will look like. So if we go back to the slide I want to have here about this topic. So this topic here, that we should apply universal jurisdiction to crimes against corruption. And this is, I think, quite a complex legal topic, but I'll break it down. I know it's a bit complicated, but I think it's useful to illustrate this. So what universal jurisdiction means is that any court in the world can hear the case. So at the moment, what needs to happen is that if I commit a crime in America, I can't be sued or held accountable for that crime in Australia because I didn't commit the crime under that jurisdiction. I committed the crime in the American jurisdiction. To be clear, I didn't commit a crime in America. But as an example, what this is saying is specifically with corruption, anyone in any court, whether you did the crime there or not, you can be taken to that court and prosecuted for that. Characterization was essential in this debate. And this is because what happened was, our debate, when I did this motion, we had a huge characterization fight in our debate about when this would actually be used. And the affirmative team wanted to say it'll just be used against a bunch of developing nations and really poor people, and it'll just be awful because, in lots of nations, corruption is just a part of the job, and it just has to be done to get ahead. So millions of people are going to have their lives ruined by this. And they tried to make the debate or this model, I should say, they tried to make the world of this model look like that. We then had to make sure that the world looked differently. So we spend at least 2 or 3 minutes in every speech explaining why the world would not look like that, and why actually it would only prosecute really, really serious crimes, because no one cares about low-level crimes because there's no reward to that. It's more effort than it's worth. And because people are sympathetic to the fact that a lot of people just have to do small acts of corruption to get ahead in a lot of places, we're dealing with big-level corruption here, like oil companies or things like that. And basically, it doesn't, all the other arguments are important in the debate. If you don't prove them well, you won't win. But that's almost like a gateway issue. If the judge believes one side view of how corruption will work, that side's probably likely to win the debate on the rest of their arguments if they're well made. So it becomes an issue of that question being the defining question of the debate and everything flowing from that. And that's why it's crucial that issues of characterization take the forefront in speeches a lot of the time to make sure the judges agree that the world is going to look the way you say it will look. So how do we do that in our cases? Think about that in prep. Make sure all the speakers agree and work out as a team what it's going to look like. So you can get up there and back it up and push back against any different characterization that comes out. And if you win that makes it a whole lot easier to win the rest of the debate. Not a guarantee, but makes it easier to do so. And then obviously if your arguments work in both characterizations, that's great, but like sometimes they just don't, and sometimes you need to win that characterization first. I believe that's all the stuff I want to talk about with regards to case building. So now I've kind of looked at how we want to do it in our case overall. I want to break it down a bit further into each of the individual speeches and how then we should think strategically about what to do in each of our speeches and how they operate. Let's start with the first speaker or the leader speeches. I think these ones are probably the least, specific strategy involved here, because most of the time they're just executing the case strategy because their job is just to get the case out there. And that should be the absolute number one priority, is get the case out there fully and in as much detail as you can within the speaking times that you're allowed. But the most important thing first speakers need to do is they need to clarify their setup and their stance quite clearly and sort of begin that characterization fight. This is particularly important if you're speaking first affirmative, because you never want to give the negative team the first bite at characterizing how the world looks, because that puts you a speech behind and you lose the advantage. As affirmative team, you want to set the debate up and then force the negative team to rebut it, not let them set it up and you have to rebut them. Be the first one in the judge's mind. So get the adjudicator to think about your characterization first up. I think that's particularly important in terms of making sure all the stuff we said before about the case is really clear in your speech. Strategically for first negative, and this is a common thing that lots of negative speakers do. It's something that I used to do a lot, but I've really tried to work on not doing so much. A lot of negative speakers will sometimes just pump out all this rebuttal for like 5-6 minutes of their speech and then try and cram their case into 2 minutes. And it's just never going to work. Unless there is something extremely important in extraneous rebuttal, and extraneous just means like separate to the rest of your arguments, you really shouldn't be doing it at first negative, because the most important thing you can do strategic-wise is get your case out there. And ideally, your case will just clash with the other side's quite directly. So if we're doing a debate about, about banning something, for example, affirmatives have an argument on why it's really bad and it can't be stopped in the status quo, and therefore a ban is justified. Presumably the negative team, you're going to have an argument about why it's not actually that bad and why the worst of it can be stopped without a ban or it can be controlled. So those arguments don't need rebuttal. They just need an opposite argument. And then leave your later speakers to do the rest of the rebuttal work and the rest of the comparisons. All you want to be doing is drawing attention to the judge that these arguments clash each other so they know to connect the dots. Otherwise, get the case out there. And that's really all that kind of is for strategy. I think that's really important or it stands out at first speakers. I think where we get into more complex or changing strategy is where we get to the later speakers in the debate, which is the second speaker. I want to split these two up because I think it provides slightly different roles. So when you look at the Deputy Prime Minister's speech, I think they need to make a choice quite clearly on what do they need to do to win immediately. And this, I think, is most important with characterization, because if you have a negative team get up at first and be like, no, the characterization is this, or if your first affirmative has, for whatever reason, not done the setup or not done the characterization properly, your absolute priority has to be to bring the debate back on that ground. And that needs to happen first thing in your speech, because that characterization influences the rest of the arguments and how the adjudicator views them. So if you just jump into some practical harm or some outcome, but haven't won the idea, or at least attempted to have rebuttal on the idea that the world will look this way, or that the characterization of the model will turn out this way, then the judge has a constant niggling thought in the back of the head. Yeah, this is good, but what about that? You want to address that first of all. And we're not mind readers. We can't all figure out exactly what the judge is thinking, or we can't know always how desperate our characterization is and challenged. But I think it is a useful rule of thumb to always try and start with winning that if necessary. So if we go back to the earlier example about where this legal power of prosecuting corruption would be used, because we so heavily challenged it at neg, what second affirmative should have done, and unfortunately I don't think they did very well in that particular debate, was actually be like, no, the crimes will happen this way, and here's why. They more just kind of jumped into directly the harms of the crimes being prosecuted against poorer people, which are all good harms. But if they're not going to actually happen, they're just wasting airtime. So the more correct strategy for that speech was to win when it would be used before they get onto the harms of it being used that way. Well, that's the first priority. So second, I think the other things I want to talk about quickly at second speaker then is just like how do you actually go about writing or setting up your speech. And I think there are kind of two broad ways you want to do it. I think what can be effective sometimes is what we call like a mirror speech, where you just take the structure of the first affirmative and just do line by line rebuttal of all the key points they say under the same headings as the first negative had. And that can be useful because it means you cover all their arguments, and because you're using the same headings they are, it's clear to the judge where your engagement is and how you're bidding them. But you can also, I think, start thematic rebuttal or thematic structures at second speaker. So thematic structures are just like bringing all the different ideas of the debate under the same heading or the same idea, so arguments and rebuttal. The way to think about it at second speaker is you ideally want your first speaker structure to be the same structure you're having throughout the whole debate. So when your first affirmative is speaking, you can start writing your speech right away. Same headings or similar issues to what your first affirmative has, little summary of what your first affirmative said, and then on a different page or different palm cards, you sub in all the rebuttal that comes to it. So when you get up there, you have a speech already structured. So you're going to say, all right, 3 issues today. First issue, is it principally just? At first affirmative, we told you X, Y, Z. What was their response? Why is it wrong? So I think that's a good strategy for how you actually start approaching writing a second affirmative speech right from the start. And then what do you do with your own substantive after that? I think it's important you still have some new substantive at second speaker, but that can just be chucked as an issue at the end of the speech, with a reasonable amount of time to do it. But you've also got to think strategically about this second speaker substantive. You've got to make the judgment, is this worth the time it's going to take to explain? So if you have an argument that maybe it's true, but the impact is small, and it's not going to swing the debate, but I need to win this other issue over here, maybe that issue just does get dropped, and you just spend time on the rebuttal. But you've got to think about where am I going to actually allocate most effectively that airtime to win the debate. And the last point here was about when do you write all this stuff. And I think I've kind of answered that broadly already. But I think you want to be sort of writing it during your first affirmative speech and then just adding rebuttal to it as the first negative is speaking, which is where a mirror speech comes in handy, because you can then just like easily group and structure that rebuttal straight away as it's being set out. A second negative, or DOL as that should say, I'm actually going to change that because it will annoy me. So I'm a bit OCD about these acronyms, and if I don't get it right, it does annoy me. So for second negative speeches, the same sort of structure can apply, mirror speeches and thematics, but I think in a second negative speech, you have more time in the debate to write, so you should be trying to prioritize thinking about the debate in terms of those themes already. Now, you have an advantage of second negative. You get to hear the first affirmative speech, and then after they're finished, you still have 2 full speeches to write out. So you almost want to think about what has first affirmative said, and while first negative is speaking, I'm just going to write functionally a full response speech to them. So all the reasons they are wrong and build all that rebuttal into the core themes or kill clashes of what the debate is. Because unlike second affirmative, so when first affirmative finishes, second affirmative only knows the AF case. When first affirmative speeches finishes, second negative knows both cases. And that gives them a big advantage to then start clashing and theming those cases really well together. So immediately from second negative, don't be thinking about just like sporadic rebuttal here and there. Start thinking about what is this debate going to really clash on. And you'll know that pretty early on by what first affirmative spends its amount of time on, and then how that will connect to what your first negative is going to spend time on. So you should have that idea from the bench, from the prep rather, and that gives you an advantage there. So immediately, I think at second, the best strategy is to start building that themes in there and start comparing those 2 speeches automatically. And then when you write it mostly all during first negative speech, and then you're just adding on the new responses that second affirmative brings to the case on an additional piece of paper and slipping them in afterwards. I think that's the strategic way you should try and approach that, and start thinking about how does this first affirmative case interact with our win strategy, and what do I need to do to it to execute our win strategy effectively. And then the substantive stuff, I think, goes the same. Either slip it into one of those themes or chuck it at the end, but again, make that determination. And like, making that determination, I should say, is something that just does come with a bit of practice. And the more debates you do, the more you'll get a sense of what is becoming important. And I think if you can sort of spend some time in different speaking roles, spending a bit of time in third speaker, I think, is useful because you get to really practice that idea of what's important in theming issues. And then you can sort of like move back up to second, and that gives you time to then like do the same thing, but do it a bit quicker in second speaker. I want to look next now at third speakers and what their strategic role should be. So I think obviously themes, again, are pretty standard for a third speaker. So what are the 3 big clashes in this debate, or 4 or 2 big clashes? But the big thing is about deciding what is important. And I think this goes back a lot to what I was saying earlier about characterization. Because at third, if you're still losing the characterization, there's not a whole lot you're going to be able to say that's going to likely win the debate until you nail that characterization issue. And this is really your last chance to do it. Unless there are reply speeches in the debate you're doing, then you kind of got like a half chance afterwards. But third is really where it lives or dies. So that should be the first issue you actually do, is try and win that characterization. Or if you're doing an active debate where it's like this house or that as the feminist movement, we would support or we would criticize female leaders regardless of their policy. Would not criticize female leaders regardless of their policy. Like, that is going to need to be the first issue to resolve, is what is in the interest of the feminist movement. Because if you can't figure out what the feminist movement actually cares about in this particular debate, then the rest of the arguments don't matter as much because they don't necessarily connect to what those interests are. So the first thing a third thing you need to think about is, are we having the debate on the right grounds? And if we are, then great. Assert that quickly, or not assert, but reprove that very quickly, or sort of show where the debate's happening, and then go into the harms of that. But if we're not, maybe that takes more airtime, and then you've got to prove that, and then just hope the rest of the arguments fall into place with the time that you've got. And I think the time of when to write this is also just during the debate as the speeches are going on, as you're trying to think about, or you should be able to see, I guess, as the debate's going on, where it's going, and you kind of get a feel for debates. And it is honestly one of the worst feelings in debating, when you know you've got a good case, but you just feel the debate slipping away from you and momentum being lost because the other team is winning the characterization. And when you've got that feeling, your primary obligation has to be to win that characterization back and put the debate on your ground. And that, when I say win the characterization, what does it actually mean? How do we do that? The answer there is about like logic and reasoning again. Why do we think that thing is likely to happen that way? Is there any evidence from a previous time a similar model's been done that we can then lean from? Is there something in the incentives of the actors that can prove that? Is there a reason why like the media is going to sell the issue to support us? And that's a whole other seminar or multiple seminars on argumentation, etc. But those are the sorts of like answers and things you need to be thinking about. And if you've sort of done your prep and your win strategy well, you'll probably have a lot of answers to that already set up, and then you'll be able to execute them straightforward from there. All right. That, I think, sort of covers the speeches aspects of it as well. The last thing I want to look at very briefly before we get to some questions is principled arguments and how to use them. Because I think sometimes the problem with principles are that teams just sort of like, I've got a principle, I've got to do it. It says so in my job description at First Affirmative, have a principle, here it is, move on, and no one talks about it again. Yay, that was fun. Principles, I think, can be lethal in debates if they are executed properly. So what are principles? Hopefully most of you know the answer to this, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, principles are like moral questions or issues of like efficacy or reasons beyond practical impacts of why we should or should not do something. So like, we would run a principle that freedom of choice or freedom of speech is absolutely paramount, and no model, no matter how good it might be practically, can ever outweigh the harms of restricting an idea of freedom of speech. So something like banning climate change denial or something like that would be a debate where freedom of speech would become really essential. The way to think about how to use principles strategically is not just to throw them out there, but to use them as a lever almost to sort of change the way the adjudicator sees the debate. So think of it this way. If there's two teams that have like practical arguments, and the negative team is winning on all the practical outcomes. It's like, they're winning. No one judges like this, but just for the example's sake, they're winning 5-3 on the quality of practical outcomes, and they're going to show that it's so much worse to do this than what it is to not do it. What your principle does is it sort of changes the framework away from a strict utilitarian approach to this to sort of say, actually, it's probably something more valuable than this. And then we add in like bonus points to make it 6-5 and then win from the opponent team, because we've shown that principally it is more justified to actually do this. So I think a good example or a good way to analogize this is something like, if we had a motion about giving additional rights to a certain group, be they some sort of disadvantaged minority group or a racial group or women or a religious or ethnic minority, something like that. Utilitarianly, whatever that full word pronounced properly would mean, if we did that way, maybe the motion shouldn't stand because we're benefiting a very small group of people, and there's a lot of other people who aren't benefited by that and they miss out. But if we principally prove that powerful people have an obligation to support, underprivileged people because they benefit off that, then we ought to do that thing principally because it is more important. And that shifts the judge's framework then to say, okay, so actually this group I should care about more, which means there's pressure on the other team to show why the practical harms or whatever are so much worse than the others would have to, because they have to overcome a principle too. Or they need to have a massively different principled obligation as to why they should do that. So if we pull our minds way back to the first example I used about former colonial powers never intervening in civil wars or picking sides in former colonies, the two clashing principles there are one about countries ought never interfere in the development of other countries because that is just more colonialism, versus the other principle around we have a moral obligation to act to stop atrocities. And what the affirmative principle about never intervening or never doing anything remotely colonial is trying to say is to say, well, look, even if there are practical benefits to intervening, even the best case we could stop the war, we ought not do that because it is immoral, and that changes the weighting of those arguments. And from the negative team, we're trying to say that even if there is some kind of like harm or potential harm around sort of issues of colonialism, but what's more important is stopping those lives, and that's then how you should value the outcome. And then we get into things about are principles contingent or not. I don't think that's particularly relevant at this point of the presentation. It's just about showing how to think about not just principles as like a thing you have to do because you have to do them, but they're actually crucial and then should feed into the rest of your case. And then like third speaker or second speaker, you get up there and you're like, well, actually, here's the principle and here's why you should think about the debate in this way that actually makes a lot of practical arguments look a lot better. All right, so there's a bit over 5 minutes to go now, and that's sort of where I was going to plan to wrap up, and I guess we'll take any questions now. Sorry if that was a bit rushed, and there's a lot of content to get through, so happy to go through some questions now. Just to clarify with the organisers, do I just go through the questions that are in the chat, or are there questions you've got for me already?
Yeah, Rob, you can go through the questions that are already in the chat. If there are any additional ones from the social media, I'll let you know.
Fantastic. All right. So for Delbert, we've got a question here about how to approach motion if a team is out of depth or they have very little knowledge of it, and like how to acquire more knowledge. That's an excellent question, and like I think a question that comes up all the time for debaters. So I think you can spend hours on this. I'll try and give you a very summarized answer as best I can. The first one, I think, is to say you should try and read a lot and sort of become generally knowledgeable on things. So the way I like to do it is I've just subscribed to a bunch of different news sites from all around the world on my social media channels. So as I'm just sitting on the train going to work or whatever, I'm just scrolling through and just reading an article that piques my interest. So that means I'm just constantly being exposed to news and constantly got a broad idea of what is going on. The other thing I think to think about is that lots of debates will always have the same kind of issues, even if you don't know the specifics of that motion or the specifics of that debate. So if I had an example earlier in the presentation about intervening in Venezuela. So say we know nothing about what's going on in Venezuela, we've got no idea we didn't even know it was a country until this debate started. The motion's asking you to intervene somewhere. And just from that alone, you can figure out there's a couple of sort of general arguments you want to be running. And that is probably, if you're affirmative team, well, if we want to intervene, they wouldn't set this motion for fun. That probably means there is a problem. So my first argument should be generating there's a problem. And probably don't know what the problem is in Venezuela, but if it's intervention, there's probably some kind of human rights issue, or there's probably some kind of war going on or something like that. And you just generate sort of like broad ideas from there. It won't always win you the debate, but it gives you something to say. And once you prove there is a problem, it's just classic stuff of like, well, if we're going to intervene economically, why are economic sanctions good? Or why, if we're going to go military, why are military likely to be successful? And you build it off basic arguments like that. So it's like having, a stock of general principled arguments. So another quick example, any motion about politics or government, the motion is, or I guess the key issues rather, are probably going to relate to things like participation, getting more people involved in politics, accountability, holding our leaders to account for the actions they take, and representation, making sure people's views are heard. So if you don't know the specifics of like who the politicians are, what the debate is, try and bring it back to those core issues. I think a good way, we haven't got time to go through it today, but I think looking up things like the Monash Association debaters Tim Sonnereich, SONNEREICH, or something like that. But if you just look up Monash debaters Tim, he wrote a guide on first principles that I think is really useful because it just goes through basic ideas that you would run in a debate, even if you don't know anything about the motion, and you're able to build a case from there. So I guess to try and summarize all that down is, even if you don't know nothing about specifics of the motion, try and think really in general terms about what the motion is asking and try and build from there. And hopefully that would sort of get you somewhere in there. The last thing I will say in here is, worst case, you know nothing about it. Give it up, get up there, have a go, give a speech. Might lose the debate, but you've learned something and you've had fun, and that's the main thing. So, like, it's totally normal to not know anything about the motion, but just keep giving it a go. I think that's all the questions I have from the chat today.
Yep, that's the question from the chat. One last question before we wrap up. What are the tips that you can give to the participants that will be joining the tournament tomorrow? Because lots of the participants in this particular seminar are participants for the competition tomorrow.
Oh, okay, this is a good one. All right. I'll try and answer this without giving away any of the motions we've worked hard on setting. I'm sure Vincentus will appreciate. I think the first tip is come in with a really open mind to like be ready to learn, not just from the judges, but from the teams you're versing as well. I think the second tip is to make sure you do ask for lots of feedback from your judges after the rounds and really try and ask them all the questions you have. Like, they're here to make your experience good and to ensure you become better debaters. So ask them lots of questions, ask for that feedback. And the third thing I think I want to say is always just like actually, there's probably going to be two more tips, sorry. So tip number 3 is just have a go. Like, get up there, give it your best shot. Even if you've got nothing to say, or you're worried your speech will be garbage, or you're worried you speak for 1 minute, just do it. Because the thing to remember is that whether you're speaking for 30 seconds or like an hour like I have, people have to listen to you for that time. You've got that floor, you own it, and they're going to listen to you. And I think that's really empowering to sort of say, like, I can do this, this is my time, and I will use it. And the last tip, I think, is make sure you think about debate strategically. So hopefully use a few of the tips we've gone through tonight and apply them in your prep and think about how all the arguments together will help you win the debate, not just as like independent thoughts going forward. I hope that gives you some tips for the weekend.
All right, thank you so much, Rob. That is the end of the questions. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much for the seminar that you have given. We hope it can be useful to all the participants in implementing strategy inside of debating.
No worries. And again, thank you very much for having me here. It was a great pleasure to speak to you all. Hopefully it was useful and you all learned something, and I can't wait to see you over the weekend.
All right, thank you so much, Robert and Vincentius. We'll see you again in our next event. Now, the rest of you, please don't go anywhere, because earlier in this event, I asked you guys, what is the name of the Asian Parliamentary Style Debate Competition participated in by students of middle schools and held by Ad America? And the right answer is B. Young Thinkers Trophy. But unfortunately, nobody got the answers right this time, so better luck next time. Now, you may be wondering, how can I develop an awesome idea for a place like this? Easy. You can go to our website at www.atamerica.or.id, click Create an Event, and collaborate with us. All proposals coming to us will be reviewed, and your event might be featured here soon. And while you're on our website, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletters for weekly event updates sent straight to your inbox. Alright everybody, I think that wraps up this episode. It has been really fun, but unfortunately we have to say goodbye for now. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter at ATAmerica for event updates, fun content, and so much more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Alright, thank you so much everybody for tuning in. We'll see you again in our next South America event. Bye-bye!